At Matthew 24:7, Jesus said, "There will be food shortages," that is to say, famine. Was this to be a feature of a composite sign that began to appear since the year 1914, along with war, pestilence, earthquakes, and lawlessness? Has famine gotten worse since 1914? If you were around in the 80s, likely you will remember the famine in Ethiopia and the pictures of starving children that haunted the nightly news. When we see such troubling images that rock us to our very core, it's very easy to believe that famine skyrocketed since 1914 like never before, especially when we hear quotations such as, "Since 1914, food shortages, or famines, have affected twice as many people as in the 900 years before. Never before the year 1914 was the whole earth short of food. And in the wake of World War I came the greatest famine of all history." But do these statements stand up to the light of truth? Have there been more famines since the year 1914? Have more people died because of famine since that year? Let's examine different regions of the world throughout time and how they relate to famine, starting in Europe. The book, The Great European Famine of 1315, 1316, and 1317 opens with these words. Famine and pestilence swept over Europe so often during the Middle Ages and exacted so frightful a toll of human life that the phenomenon has come to be regarded as one of the most impressive features of the period. The Great Famine from 1315 to 1317 caused millions of deaths in Europe. Some believed it wiped out 10% of the population of Great Britain. The 1590s saw the worst famines in centuries spread across Europe. The Great Famine in Finland in 1696 killed a third of the population and roughly 10% of Norway's population. Two massive famines struck France between 1693 and 1710, killing over 2 million people. One historian wrote, "Any national calculation shows a sad story. France, by any standards a privileged nation, is reckoned to have experienced 10 general famines during the 10th century, 26 in the 11th, 2 in the 12th, 4 in the 14th, 7 in the 15th, 13 in the 16th, 11 in the 17th, and 16 in the 18th. While one cannot guarantee the accuracy of the 18th century calculation, the only risk it runs is in over-optimism, because it omits the hundreds and hundreds of local famines. In the late 1690s, Scotland experienced a famine which reduced its population in parts of Scotland by at least 15%. Another famine in Finland in 1866 to 1868 killed 15% of the population. According to Scott and Duncan, Eastern Europe experienced more than 150 recorded famines between AD 1500 and 1700, and there were 100 hunger years and 121 famine years in Russia between AD 971 and 1974. There were 37 famine years in Iceland between 1500 and 1804. 10,000 people died, a fifth of the population of Iceland. The last great famine in Europe was the potato famine in Ireland, which left 1 million dead. To be sure, famines afflicted Europe into the 20th century, in particular in Russia and Eastern Europe. Overall, in Europe, famine has been on the decline in the 20th century. In fact, famine is unheard of in Europe in modern times. Why is this? The book Famines in India says, before the industrial commercial revolutions occurred in Europe, famine was a natural calamity from which no part of the world was completely immune. Today, when we think of famine, we associate it primarily with the continent of Africa. But in the not-too-distant past, many associated the word with Asia. China used to be called the land of famine. To be sure, in the 20th century, China saw major famines. However, this was nothing new. The book, China, Land of Famine, says, the food problem is an ancient one in China. From the earliest times, famines have been an ever-recurring scourge. A study recently completed by the Student Agricultural Society of the University of Nanking brought to light the surprising and significant fact that between the years 108 BC and 1911 AD, there were 1,828 famines, or one nearly every year in some of the provinces. Untold millions have died of starvation. The book Fearful Famines in the Past says, the four famines of 1810, 1811, 1846, and 1849 are said to have taken a toll of not less than 45 million lives. The book Geopolitics of Hunger reports that some 100 million individuals starved to death in China. However, what about in more recent times? One work says, since 1962, despite a population increase of about 2% a year, agriculture has expanded at the annual rate of 4% and has been able to keep pace well enough to banish the specter of famine completely. Another nation that experienced problems with famine was India. The book Famines in India said, India has suffered from famine since time immemorial. The greatest famine on record was in the year 1769 to 1770, where some estimate 1/3 of the Indian population perished. However, in more recent times it has been reported, over the last 2 decades we have succeeded in avoiding deaths from starvation in any part of the country. And because of technical and organizational measures, India's nutritional situation until 1966, among the worst in the world, began to show signs of reaching a turning point. During the past 2 years, farm production has increased at a rate of 8%, which is a real miracle. Time magazine said, the most important gains have been made in food production. 15 years ago, India had to rely heavily on imported grain to feed its hungry millions, and drought was regularly a life-or-death issue. The country is now self-sufficient in food. Since 1971, grain production has increased by 40%, largely as a result of the Green Revolution, the scientific program of using high-yield seeds and extensive irrigation that began in the mid-1960s. Overall, how do famine and hunger stack up today when compared prior to 1914? Bruce F. Johnston, in his article on famine, said, but there is every indication that the incidence in earlier times was considerably greater than it is today in nearly all inhabited areas of the world. In the book, The Resourceful Earth, we read, famine deaths have decreased in the past century, even in absolute terms, let alone relative to population. Food expert Professor D. Gale Johnson said, we might be inclined to deduce from the pictorial evidence of famine that we have seen recently on television, in newspapers, and in magazines that the world is more prone to famine now than it used to be, but the evidence is clearly to the contrary. There has been a rather substantial reduction in the incidence of famine during the past century.